Wife faked terminal illness to test rich husband. What she discovered broke her heart. Did Grace's perfect marriage really last 38 years, or was it all an illusion? When her husband, a respected surgeon, starts acting mysteriously and her medical tests show concerning results, Grace discovers a web of lies that will change everything. But in this game of deception, who is really playing whom? Join us in this gripping story about love, betrayal, and the courage to start over, where nothing is quite what it seems, and the sweetest revenge comes with its own melody. Get ready for a tale that will make you question everything you think you know about trust, second chances, and the true meaning of happily ever after. The annual hospital charity dinner was in full swing at the Springfield Country Club. Grace smoothed her navy blue dress and glanced at her watch for the third time. Richard was late again. She caught the worried looks from the hospital board members, but maintained her graceful smile, the same smile she'd perfected over 38 years of marriage to one of Massachusetts' most respected surgeons. "Mrs. Walker, will you play for us tonight?" asked Mrs. Henderson, one of the regular donors. "Oh, I don't know," Grace replied, her eyes still fixed on the entrance. The baby grand piano stood in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the crystal chandeliers. It had been years since she'd performed publicly. The memory of her last concert at the conservatory flooded back. She was 22 and Richard had just proposed. "You can't be a surgeon's wife and a concert pianist," he'd said. "The hospital events, the social obligations, you'll have to choose, darling." And she had chosen him, transforming her passion for music into organizing these charity events that had helped build Richard's career. Emily, their daughter and now a pediatrician at the same hospital, approached with her 2 children. "Mom, the Hendersons are asking about Dad again. Tell them he's running late from surgery," Grace said automatically, though she knew there hadn't been any emergency procedures scheduled for today. James, their son and a corporate lawyer in Boston, watched his mother from across the room while bouncing his youngest on his knee. He'd inherited her intuition and Richard's sharp features, and lately she'd noticed him watching his father with the same concerned expression she tried to hide. When Richard finally arrived, his collar was slightly askew and he smelled of unfamiliar perfume when he kissed her cheek. "Sorry, darling. Emergency consultation." His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he turned away slightly to check it, a small smile playing on his lips. Later that evening, during Sunday service at First Baptist, Grace noticed him checking his phone again during Pastor Mike's sermon. The message notification illuminated his face in the dim church light, and for a moment she saw a stranger instead of her husband of nearly 4 decades. "Everything okay?" she whispered. "Hospital business," he muttered, but his fingers moved quickly to close the message. After church, during their traditional family lunch, Grace watched as Richard's attention remained fixed on his phone under the table while their grandchildren shared stories about school and soccer games. Emily's 10-year-old Sarah was describing her piano recital, and for the first time in years, Richard didn't even pretend to listen. "Remember when you used to play, Grandma?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with admiration. "That was a long time ago, sweetheart," Grace replied, catching Richard's dismissive glance. "Mom was headed for Carnegie Hall," Emily added, "weren't you, Mom?" "Your mother made the right choice," Richard interjected, finally looking up from his phone. "She's been invaluable to my career. These charity dinners don't organize themselves." Grace felt something shift inside her at his words. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet awakening. She watched as he excused himself early from lunch, claiming paperwork at the hospital. Through the window, she saw him check his reflection in the car mirror before driving away, something he'd never done in all their years together. That evening, as she arranged the donor thank you notes at her desk, Grace found herself opening the drawer where she kept her old concert programs. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the yellowed paper, and for the first time in decades, she wondered about the choice she'd made. The house felt unusually quiet. Their colonial home, once filled with children's laughter and music, now echoed with the sound of Richard's increasingly frequent absences. Grace walked to the piano in the living room, lifted the cover, and pressed one key, then quickly closed it as she heard Richard's car in the driveway. She had built her life around his dreams, their family, and these charity events. But as she prepared for bed that night, watching Richard immerse himself in his phone again, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was changing. The familiar rhythm of their life together was hitting discordant notes, and for the first time in 38 years, she wasn't sure she liked the melody. Grace sat in her usual spot at the church choir practice, noticing Richard's empty seat in the front pew for the third Sunday in a row. Pastor Mike caught her eye with a sympathetic smile as she sang, her voice blending with the familiar hymns that had once brought her such comfort. The following Tuesday, during her routine checkup at Springfield Medical Center, Grace was updating her medical history when a young nurse she hadn't seen before approached the desk. "Mrs. Walker? I'm Jessica Miller, Dr. Thompson's new surgical nurse." The woman was in her early 30s, with perfect makeup even in her scrubs. "Dr. Walker asked me to handle your paperwork personally." Something in Jessica's tone made Grace look up sharply. The nurse held her gaze a moment too long before turning away, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked to the records room. While waiting, Grace noticed her file lying open on the counter. She glanced around and, seeing no one watching, leaned forward to read. Her heart stopped. There, in recent notes she hadn't authorized, were references to concerning symptoms she'd never reported. "Those records are confidential," Jessica's voice cut through her thoughts. Grace straightened up, but not before seeing Richard's signature on tests she'd never taken. Later that afternoon, as Grace was leaving, she heard voices from around the corner. She recognized Richard's laugh, not his usual one, but softer, intimate. "We have to be careful," Jessica was saying. "Your wife was looking at her records today." "Grace never questions medical documents," Richard replied. "She trusts me completely. That's always been her weakness." Grace pressed herself against the wall, her hands trembling. Through the reflection in a glass cabinet, she could see them standing close, too close for a doctor and nurse. "Dr. Rebecca wants to see you," a voice called out, making Grace jump. It was Maria, Rebecca's assistant, looking at her with concern. In Rebecca's office, Grace's oldest friend and family doctor studied her pale face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think," Grace paused, gathering her courage. "I think Richard is falsifying my medical records." Rebecca's expression shifted from concern to alarm. She pulled up Grace's digital file, her frown deepening as she read. "These symptoms, this doesn't match any of our discussions." "There's more," Grace said quietly. "The new nurse, Jessica Miller." Recognition flashed across Rebecca's face. Jessica's developed quite a reputation in the hospital. She's worked at 3 different hospitals in 2 years, always in departments headed by married doctors. Grace's hands clenched in her lap. "She seems very familiar with Richard." Rebecca leaned forward. "Grace, there's something you should know. Jessica was transferred from Boston General after a scandal involving a senior surgeon. The details were kept quiet, but..." A knock interrupted them. Through the door's window, Grace saw Jessica walking past, her hand brushing Richard's arm as they passed. "I need copies of my real medical records," Grace said suddenly. "And I need to know everything about Jessica Miller." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I'll help you, but Grace, be careful. If Richard is actually falsifying medical documents, he's planning something." Grace finished, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And I need to find out what." That evening, as Grace prepared dinner, she watched Richard check his phone constantly. When Emily called to confirm Sunday lunch, he quickly made an excuse about a medical conference. "Since when do you have a conference?" Grace asked casually. "It just came up," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Jessica, Nurse Miller, is coordinating the schedules." Grace turned back to the stove, hiding her expression. After 38 years of marriage, she had learned to read the signs. Something was very wrong, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to simply trust and accept. She waited until Richard was in the shower before calling Emily. "Sweetheart, I need you to do something for me, but you can't tell your father." "Mom? What's wrong?" "I need you to find out everything you can about a nurse named Jessica Miller." "But Emily, be discreet." After hanging up, Grace sat at her piano, running her fingers silently over the keys. The woman in the hospital hadn't been just a nurse talking to her boss. Grace had seen that look before. in her own eyes, 38 years ago at the conservatory. But this time, she wouldn't be the one giving up her dreams. Grace waited until Richard left for his morning rounds before opening his laptop again. Her hands trembled as she clicked through his emails, each message confirming her worst fears. "Everything's arranged," read an email from 3 weeks ago. "Once we have confirmation of terminal diagnosis, we can proceed with the property transfers." Jessica's reply appeared below. "You're sure she won't question the test results? What about Dr. Chen?" "Rebecca won't be involved. Grace trusts me completely. After 38 years, she believes everything I say." Grace heard the front door open and quickly closed the laptop. Emily's voice called out, "Mom?" "In the study, sweetheart," Grace answered, trying to steady her voice. Emily appeared in the doorway. "I brought you some soup. Dad mentioned you weren't feeling well." Grace forced a smile. "That's thoughtful of you." "Mom, are you okay? You look upset." "Just tired." Grace stood, moving away from Richard's desk. "How are the kids?" "Sarah asked why you missed her piano recital yesterday." Grace frowned. "What recital? Richard told me it was next week." "No, it was." Emily paused, studying her mother's face. "Dad said you weren't feeling up to it." Grace drove straight to the hospital, finding Rebecca in her office. She placed Richard's printed emails on the desk. "I need you to look at something," Grace said. "And I need you to be my doctor, not Richard's colleague." Rebecca read through the emails, her expression darkening. "They've been falsifying your test results. Grace, this is serious misconduct." "There's more." Grace pulled up Richard's personal email on her phone. "They're planning their future together, in Miami, with my inheritance." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "We need to report this to the medical board." "Not yet." Grace sat down heavily. "I need to understand how far this goes first." "Grace, this isn't just about your marriage. They're committing medical fraud." "I know." Grace closed her eyes. "But if I report it now, Richard will know I discovered everything. I need time to protect myself first." "What are you thinking? They want me sick? Fine, I'll be sick." Grace opened her eyes. "But I need your help. You want to play along?" Rebecca looked concerned. "Grace, lying isn't like you. Neither is being made a fool of." Grace's voice cracked. 38 years, Rebecca, I gave up everything for him." That evening, Grace sat in the empty church, where she'd prayed every week for decades. Pastor Mike found her there. "Heavy thoughts?" he asked, sitting nearby. "When does protecting yourself become wrong?" Grace asked. "When does seeking the truth become revenge?" "Truth without compassion is just another form of violence," he replied. "But compassion without truth isn't really compassion at all." Grace drove home, her decision made. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw Jessica's car turn the corner at the end of their street. Inside, Richard was on the phone. "Yes, darling, everything's arranged. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Just a few more months." Grace cleared her throat. Richard spun around, quickly ending the call. "Who was that?" she asked. "Hospital administrator." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "Very tired. You should rest." He kissed her forehead. "Doctor's orders." That night, Grace lay awake again, planning her next steps. The woman who'd given up her music career for Richard's dreams was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd finally started playing her own melody again. She thought of Sarah's missed recital, of the falsified medical records, of Jessica's car disappearing around the corner. The truth was painful, but pretending was worse. Tomorrow, she would begin her performance. Not at the piano this time, but in a different kind of recital altogether. And this time, she would play every note perfectly. Grace began her performance the next morning at breakfast. She let her hand shake slightly as she poured coffee, spilling a few drops on the tablecloth. "Are you all right?" Richard asked, looking up from his phone. "Just a little unsteady today," she replied, watching his reaction carefully. He set his phone down. "Perhaps we should run some more tests." Later that week, Grace sat in Rebecca's office for her staged checkup. "Dizzy spells are getting worse," she said, loud enough for the passing nurses to hear. Rebecca played her part perfectly. "We should monitor these symptoms closely." The news spread through the hospital quickly. Grace noticed how the nurses whispered when she visited, how they gave her sympathetic looks. Jessica was particularly attentive, almost overplaying her concern. Emily caught up with Grace in the hospital parking lot. Mom, why didn't you tell me about these symptoms? I didn't want to worry you, Grace said, hating the lie, but knowing it was necessary. Dad seems different lately, Emily continued, almost relieved. That can't be right. Grace touched her daughter's arm. Your father has his own way of dealing with things. At home, Grace found Richard in his study reviewing papers. What are those? She asked. Just some property documents. We should consider simplifying our assets given the circumstances. She nodded, noting how he quickly shuffled the papers away. The following Tuesday, Grace visited the public library's music section, seeking comfort in her old sheet music books. As she reached for a Mozart collection, another hand touched the same book. I'm sorry, a man said. Please, go ahead. She turned to see a gentleman about her age, with kind eyes and silver hair. Do you play? She asked. Used to, now I just read about it. I'm Michael. Grace, and I used to play too. Their conversation was interrupted by Grace's phone, a text from Richard. Where are you? You should be resting. That evening, Grace sat with her grandchildren. 10-year-old Sarah leaned against her. Grandma, are you really sick? Grace's heart clenched. Sometimes people get sick, sweetheart. But you'll get better, right? Before Grace could answer, she heard Richard in the hallway, talking in hushed tones. Yes, the property on Oak Street too. No, she won't question it. Just a few more months, darling. 2 days later, Grace nearly revealed everything when Emily brought lunch to her house. Her daughter looked so worried, so sincere. Mom, what aren't you telling me? Grace gripped her teacup tighter. What do you mean? Something feels wrong. Dad's selling properties. You're suddenly sick and he's never around. Emily. Grace started, then saw Richard's car pulling into the driveway. I'm just tired, that's all. The nurses at the hospital were becoming suspicious. Grace overheard two of them discussing Richard and Jessica's late-night meetings. One morning, she arrived early and saw Jessica leaving Richard's office, adjusting her blouse. Mrs. Walker, Jessica exclaimed, you shouldn't be here so early. Does Dr. Walker know you're up? I couldn't sleep, Grace replied, watching Jessica's nervous movements. That afternoon, Grace returned to the library, finding herself hoping to see Michael again. He was there, reading a book about classical composers. Grace, he smiled warmly. How's the Mozart treating you? I haven't played in years, she admitted. Sometimes the music we stop playing keeps singing inside us, he said. Grace felt tears threatening and quickly excused herself. In the parking lot, she saw Richard driving past with Jessica in the passenger seat. They didn't notice her. That evening, Richard announced he was selling their vacation home in Vermont. It's for the best, he said. We should focus on your treatment. Grace watched him make calls, arrange papers, slowly dismantling their life together while pretending it was for her benefit. The performance was exhausting, but she reminded herself that every great recital required perfect timing. And she was just getting started. Grace waited until Richard left for his medical conference to visit his home office. In the bottom drawer of his desk, she found a stack of financial documents that made her blood run cold. Bank transfers, property assessments, and a draft of a new will dated 2 weeks ago. Everything looks clear, read a note from his lawyer. Once the medical documentation is complete, the asset transfer can proceed as planned. She photographed everything with trembling hands, then carefully returned the papers exactly as she'd found them. Next to them was a brochure for a beachfront property in Miami. When her phone rang, she jumped. It was Emily. Mom, did you know Dad's going to a conference in Chicago this weekend? Grace's stomach tightened. Yes. Why? Because I just saw his name on a flight manifest to Miami. Jessica Morrison is booked on the same flight. Emily, I need you to pretend you don't know that. Mom, what's going on? Trust me, sweetheart, I'm handling it. At the library the next day, Michael was waiting in their usual spot. Over the past weeks, their conversations had become a lifeline. I brought something for you, he said, sliding a book across the table. Sheet music. Chopin. I haven't touched a piano in years. My late wife was a music teacher, he said. She always said music finds us when we need it most. Grace found herself sharing more than she intended. My husband's planning to leave me. He thinks I'm dying. Michael's expression remained calm. But you're not. No, I'm not. That afternoon, Grace visited a small music studio downtown. The owner, Mrs. Chen's cousin, recognized her name. Dr. Walker's wife? Rebecca mentioned you might come by. The piano in the practice room was old but well-maintained. Grace's fingers hovered over the keys, then slowly began to play. The melody was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. Meanwhile, James was discovering his own pieces of the puzzle. As a corporate lawyer, he noticed discrepancies in the hospital's recent financial reports. "Mom," he called that evening, "I found something weird in Dad's department records. Large consulting payments to a shell company. Jessica Morrison's name is on the paperwork." "Keep digging," Grace said, "but be careful." The next day, Grace overheard two board members discussing financial irregularities in Richard's department. Large sums marked for equipment had disappeared into consulting fees. When Richard returned from Miami, tanned and distracted, Grace played her part perfectly. She let him find her napping in her chair, medical papers scattered nearby. "You shouldn't worry about these things," he said, gathering the papers. "I'm taking care of everything." "I know you are," she replied softly, watching him lock the documents in his desk. That night, Grace slipped out after Richard fell asleep. At the studio, her fingers found the keys again, playing with growing confidence. The music she'd buried for decades was awakening. Rebecca called the next morning. "The board is asking questions about those consulting payments. Richard's getting nervous." "Good," Grace said. "Let him worry." Later at their usual library meeting, Michael listened as Grace played a recording of her practice session. "You never lost it," he said. "You just stored it away." "I stored away a lot of things," she replied, "but not anymore." When she returned home, Richard was packing another bag. "Emergency medical conference," he said quickly. "Just for a few days." Grace nodded, watching him rush out. Through the window, she saw Jessica's car waiting down the street. In her own quiet way, Grace was coming back to life. Every note she played in secret, every document she discovered, every lie she uncovered, they were all steps toward her liberation. The woman who had silenced herself for love was finding her voice again, and this time no one would silence her. Richard chose Le Jardin, their favorite restaurant for the past 30 years, to end their marriage. Grace had expected it. She'd seen him rehearsing his speech in his study the night before. "Grace, darling," he began, not quite meeting her eyes. "These past months have been difficult." "Yes, they have," she replied, taking a small sip of water. "Watching you like this, I can't do it anymore. The doctors say your condition is progressing faster than expected." Grace noticed how he glanced at his phone, probably texting updates to Jessica. "Go on." "I think we need to face reality. I've spoken with my lawyers." He pulled out a folder. "A divorce would protect our assets, ensure proper care for you." The restaurant continued its dinner service around them as 38 years of marriage ended on crisp legal papers. "You've already signed them," Grace observed, noting the date. 2 weeks ago, when he was supposedly in Chicago. "It's better this way," he said. "You need specialized care. I can't provide that anymore." Before Grace could respond, Emily appeared at their table. She'd been having dinner with colleagues in the next room. "Dad, what are you doing here? I thought you had surgery tonight." Richard's face paled. "Emily, this isn't." "Are those divorce papers?" Emily snatched the folder. "You're divorcing Mom while she's sick? Your mother needs specialized care. Is that what you're calling Jessica Morrison now? Specialized care?" The restaurant went quiet. Richard stood up abruptly. "This isn't the place." "I saw you," Emily continued, her voice shaking. "Last week, in Miami. Both of you." Grace touched her daughter's arm. "Emily, please sit down." "No, Mom, he's leaving you for that." James arrived, having been called by Emily's colleague. "What's going on?" "Dad?" Richard looked trapped. "Son, you don't understand." "I understand plenty," James replied coldly. "I found the financial records, the fake consulting company. Does the hospital board know? You've been investigating me?" "Someone had to," James said, "while you were planning to abandon our mother." Richard's phone buzzed. Jessica's name flashed on the screen. Emily saw it and laughed bitterly. "Perfect timing. Go ahead, Dad. Answer it. Show everyone exactly who you are." "I can't do this," Richard muttered, gathering his things. "The papers need to be signed by Friday." He walked out of the restaurant, leaving his family and 3 decades of memories behind. Grace sat quietly through the storm of her children's reactions. "Mom, you can't sign those papers," Emily pleaded. "We'll fight this," James added. "I'll contact every lawyer I know." "No," Grace said firmly. Let him go." That night, the church community rallied around Grace. Pastor Mike's wife brought casseroles. The choir ladies organized a prayer circle. But Grace didn't tell them the truth, not yet. At home, she watched Richard pack his bags. "I'll send for the rest later," he said. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. He paused. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not." As his car disappeared down the driveway, Grace walked to her piano. She played a single note, then another. By midnight, she was playing full pieces, letting the music wash away 38 years of silence. The next morning, Michael was waiting at their usual library spot. "I heard what happened," he said. "The medical community talks." "Play with me," Grace said, leading him to the library's old piano. "I need to remember what real harmony sounds like." Their duet drew a small crowd. Among them was Sarah, who'd come with Emily to check on her grandmother. "I didn't know you could still play, Grandma," Sarah whispered. Grace smiled at her granddaughter. "There's a lot people don't know about me, sweetheart, but they're about to find out." That evening, Grace received a text from Richard. "Jessica and I are leaving for Miami tomorrow. The lawyers will contact you." She didn't reply. Instead, she drove to the music studio and played until her fingers ached, each note stronger than the last. The woman who had lived in Richard's shadow was stepping into her own light, and the melody she played now was entirely her own. 3 weeks after Richard's departure, Grace prepared for her first private recital at the music studio. Her small audience consisted of Rebecca, Michael, and Sarah. "Are you nervous, Grandma?" Sarah asked, helping her arrange the sheet music. "A little," Grace admitted. "It's been a long time." As her fingers touched the keys, decades of silence melted away. She played Chopin's Nocturne, the same piece she'd performed the night Richard proposed. But this time, the music told a different story. "That was beautiful," Michael said afterward. "You've been practicing." Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "My lawyer says you haven't signed the papers. Also, someone's been asking questions at the hospital about your condition." Grace showed the message to Rebecca. "He's getting suspicious." "Well, he should be," Rebecca replied. "The board is auditing his department." Meanwhile, in Miami, Richard was growing increasingly paranoid. He called Emily twice that week, asking about Grace's health. "How is she really doing?" he pressed. "Why do you care?" Emily shot back. "You left her. I have a right to know. You lost that right when you chose Jessica." Grace's transformation wasn't just musical. She started taking walks with Michael, joined a book club, and returned to the church choir. The congregation welcomed her back warmly, though some whispered about her quick recovery. "You're glowing," Michael observed during their daily library meetup. "It suits you." Their relationship grew naturally, built on shared experiences and mutual understanding. Michael knew the pain of betrayal. His first wife had left him for another man 20 years ago. One afternoon, Grace nearly ruined everything. She was playing piano at the studio when Richard's sister Mary stopped by unexpectedly. "Grace, I thought you were too ill to leave the house." Grace quickly faked a coughing fit. "Just trying to keep my spirits up. Music therapy." That evening, James called with news. "Dad's been moving money around, large transfers to offshore accounts." "Keep tracking them," Grace said. "But be careful, he's getting nervous." The next day, Rebecca brought more updates. "The hospital board found irregularities in patient records. Not just yours. Jessica's been altering files for months." Grace nodded. Everything's coming together. Her children noticed the changes in their mother. The sadness in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet determination. She laughed more, played with her grandchildren, and seemed younger somehow. "You're different," Emily observed during Sunday lunch. "I'm just becoming myself again," Grace replied. One evening, while practicing at the studio, Michael brought her tea. They played a duet, their hands occasionally touching on the keys. "Richard called me today," he said. "Asked if I'd seen you at the library." "What did you tell him?" "That I mind my own business, but Grace, he's digging." The next morning, Grace received another text from Richard. "Your last test results seem unusual. I'm flying back to review them." She forwarded the message to Rebecca. "He's coming back." "Good," Rebecca replied. "The board wants to speak with him anyway." That afternoon, Grace played for her grandchildren in the studio. Sarah recorded it on her phone, but Grace made her promise not to share it. "Why not, Grandma?" You play so beautifully. It's our secret for now, sweetheart." Later, Michael drove her home. In the car, he reached for her hand. "Whatever happens next, you're not alone." Grace squeezed his hand, thinking of the life she'd lived in Richard's shadow and the woman she was becoming. The music had awakened something in her that could never be silenced again. That night, she received one last text from Richard. "Flying back tomorrow. We need to talk about your condition." Grace smiled at her reflection in the window. Yes, they certainly did need to talk about her condition, just not the one he was expecting to discuss. Rebecca's office buzzed with tension as she reviewed Grace's latest test results with the hospital board members. The numbers showed a dramatic decline in Grace's health. "Send these to Dr. Walker immediately," Grace instructed. "Make sure Jessica sees them too." Within hours, Richard called Emily in a panic. "Your mother's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought that's what you wanted," Emily replied coldly. "More reason to rush your divorce." In Miami, Richard and Jessica accelerated their plans. Grace intercepted their emails through Richard's still logged-in hospital account. "The beach house closing is next week," Jessica wrote. "Once the divorce is final, we can announce our engagement." Grace forwarded everything to James, who added it to his growing file of evidence. The hospital board's investigation was reaching its final stages, but timing was crucial. One afternoon, Jessica made an unexpected visit to Springfield General. Grace barely made it out of the music studio in time, leaving Michael to cover for her. "I'm just checking old patient files," Jessica told the suspicious nurse at the records desk. Later, Michael recounted the close call to Grace. "She's definitely suspicious. Asked a lot of questions about you." "How much longer do we need?" Grace asked Rebecca over the phone. "The board meets next Friday. They have enough evidence of financial fraud, but they're still reviewing the falsified medical records." Grace's plan was coming together, but the risks were mounting. That evening, during choir practice, Richard's sister Mary mentioned seeing Grace at the grocery store. "You looked surprisingly well," Mary observed. "Good days and bad days," Grace replied, quickly changing the subject. The next morning, during their library meeting, Michael surprised Grace with concert tickets. Springfield Symphony next month, Chopin's Complete Nocturnes. "Michael, I don't know if—" He took her hand. "Grace, I've watched you come alive these past months. Would you consider having dinner with me? A real dinner?" Before she could answer, they spotted Jessica walking into the library. Grace slipped out the back entrance while Michael distracted her with questions about hospital procedures. That evening, Grace received an urgent call from James. "Dad's liquidating more assets. He's getting nervous about something." "Good," Grace replied. "Let him worry." The next day, Rebecca brought more news. The board found more altered records. "Not just yours, at least a dozen patients." Grace nodded. "Everything's ready for next week?" The board meets at 10 a.m. Richard's flight gets in at 8. Later that night, Michael invited Grace to his home for dinner. In his living room stood a beautiful grand piano. "Play with me?" he asked. Their duet filled the room, their hands moving in perfect synchronization. When the music ended, Michael turned to her. "Grace, I know the timing isn't right, but—" She stopped him with a gentle touch. "The timing is exactly right." Their first kiss was interrupted by Grace's phone. A text from Richard, "We need to discuss funeral arrangements for after." Grace showed Michael the message. "He's planning my funeral while I'm planning his downfall." "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" "He didn't just betray me," Grace replied. "He betrayed his oath as a doctor, his children's trust, everything we built together." The next morning, Grace found Jessica waiting in the hospital parking lot. "You don't look very sick," Jessica accused. "Appearances can be deceiving," Grace replied calmly. "You should know that better than anyone." That evening, as Grace finished her practice session at the studio, she received one final email from Richard. "Arriving Friday. Called the funeral home. Everything will be taken care of." Grace closed her piano, thinking of the performance yet to come. This would be her finest recital, one that Richard would never forget. Friday morning arrived with a steady rain. Grace checked her phone. Richard's flight had landed on time. Jessica's social media showed them arriving together at Springfield International Airport. "Are you ready?" Rebecca asked during their final meeting. I've been ready for months, Grace replied. The hospital boardroom filled quickly. Richard and Jessica entered, both looking tanned from their Miami stay. They froze at the sight of Grace sitting calmly at the table. Grace, what are you doing here? Richard's face paled. You should be in bed. I'm exactly where I need to be, Grace replied. The board chairman cleared his throat. Dr. Walker, we've called this meeting to discuss serious allegations of medical fraud and financial misconduct. What allegations? Richard looked at Jessica, who had started edging toward the door. James stood up, opening his briefcase. Let's start with the falsified medical records. Not just my mother's, but dozens of patients. This is ridiculous, Richard scoffed. My wife is seriously ill. Ask Dr. Morrison. Actually, Rebecca interrupted, Grace has never been healthier. We have her real test results right here. Grace watched as Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The board presented evidence of financial fraud, altered medical records, and misappropriated funds. The offshore accounts were clever, James added, but you should have used a better tax attorney. Jessica suddenly spoke up. I had nothing to do with this. Dr. Walker ordered all the changes. Richard spun toward her. You submitted those records? Under your direction. Jessica's voice rose. You said it was the only way we could be together. Emily stood up. Together? While planning our mother's funeral? Planning my funeral? Grace's voice cut through the chaos. While I was still alive? The room fell silent. Grace opened her folder, revealing printouts of emails, bank transfers, and property records. 38 years, she said quietly. I gave you 38 years, and you couldn't even wait for me to actually die before planning your new life. Grace, I can explain. The beach house in Miami? She continued. The offshore accounts? The falsified medical records? Please, explain. Jessica burst into tears. He said you were dying. He said once you were gone, we'd have everything. Miss Morrison, the board chairman interrupted, I suggest you contact a lawyer immediately. Security arrived to escort Jessica out. Richard remained, his face ashen as the board detailed the consequences. Medical license suspended, pending criminal investigation, immediate termination. Grace, he tried one last time. Everything I did was for us. No, she cut him off. Everything you did was for yourself. It always was. The meeting ended with Richard being escorted from the building. In the parking lot, Jessica was already on her phone with her lawyer, distancing herself from the scheme. Emily hugged her mother. Mom, you were amazing. I had help, Grace said, smiling at Michael, who had waited outside. News spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses who had suspected something was wrong came to express their support. Even Richard's sister Mary appeared, apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner. That evening, Grace sat at her piano at home, Michael beside her. How do you feel? He asked. Free, she replied. For the first time in decades, completely free. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. You destroyed everything. No, she typed back. You did that all by yourself. Later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Grace played the piano while Sarah recorded it openly this time. No more secrets, no more pretending. The woman who had been silenced for so long had finally found her voice, and she would never be quiet again. The hospital board's disciplinary hearing lasted 4 hours. Richard sat alone. His lawyer had advised him to settle, but he insisted on fighting. Dr. Walker, the chairman began, the evidence shows a systematic pattern of fraud spanning months. Richard glanced at the empty seat where Jessica should have been. She'd already struck a deal, agreeing to testify against him in exchange for leniency. I've served this hospital for 30 years, Richard protested, which makes this betrayal even worse, a board member replied. The verdict was unanimous. Immediate license suspension, pending criminal investigation. As security cleared out his office, Richard watched decades of achievement reduced to a single cardboard box. Grace declined to attend the hearing. Instead, she met with her children at James's office to discuss the divorce settlement. He's asking for joint property rights, James said. No. Grace's voice was firm. He forfeited those rights when he started hiding money offshore. Emily touched her mother's hand. The DA wants to press criminal charges. Are you sure you want that? This isn't about revenge, Grace replied. It's about justice. Not just for me, but for every patient whose records he falsified. That afternoon, Jessica's testimony hit the local news. She painted herself as a victim of Richard's manipulation, claiming he had orchestrated everything. "He told me his wife was dying," she sobbed to reporters. "He made me help falsify the records." Grace turned off the TV and went to her piano. Michael arrived with dinner, having become a constant support during these difficult days. "The hospital board called," he said. "They want to name the new music therapy program after you." Grace shook her head. "I didn't do this for recognition." The next morning, Richard appeared at Grace's door, looking disheveled. "Please, Grace, everything I built is gone." "You destroyed it yourself," she replied calmly. "Every lie, every betrayal, those were your choices." "I loved you," he tried. "No," she corrected him. "You loved what I gave up for you. There's a difference." Later that week, Grace and Michael attended a charity concert together. It was their first public appearance as a couple. During intermission, she received a text from Jessica. "I'm sorry. I never meant for things to go so far." Grace didn't reply. Some apologies came too late. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. Richard, facing criminal charges, agreed to Grace's terms. The properties were divided, with Grace keeping the house and her family's inheritances. "You're being generous," James observed, reviewing the settlement. "I'm being fair," Grace corrected. "That's different from generous." 1 month later, Grace and Michael stood in front of their families and friends at First Baptist Church. Pastor Mike smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. "Love is built on trust," he said during the ceremony. "And trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt with truth." Sarah played the wedding march on the piano. Her grandmother had been teaching her for the past few months. At the reception, Emily raised her glass. "To my mother, who taught us that it's never too late to start over." That evening, Grace received one final email from Richard. He was taking a position at a small clinic in Arizona, trying to rebuild his life. "I understand now what I lost," he wrote. "Not just my career or reputation, but the trust of someone who gave up everything for me. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Grace closed her laptop without replying. Some chapters needed to stay closed. Later, as she played the piano with Michael beside her, Grace reflected on the past year. She had lost a husband, but found herself. The music she'd silenced for so long was finally free, and this time, no one would ever silence it again. "Ready for our next chapter?" Michael asked. Grace smiled, starting a new melody. "More than ready." The Springfield Symphony Hall buzzed with anticipation. Grace sat backstage, reviewing her music one last time. Her first public recital in 38 years was a benefit concert for the hospital's new music therapy program. "Ready?" Michael squeezed her hand. "Nervous," she admitted, "but good nervous." The program listed her as Grace Bennett, her new married name. In the front row, her grandchildren fidgeted in their Sunday best. Sarah clutched her own sheet music. They would play a duet for the finale. As Grace stepped onto the stage, she spotted Rebecca in the audience. Her friend had been instrumental in establishing the Grace Bennett Foundation for Women's Empowerment, which would receive the concert's proceeds. The first notes of Chopin filled the hall. Grace played with confidence, years of silence transforming into pure music. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. During intermission, a woman approached her backstage. "Mrs. Bennett, your story inspired me to leave my abusive husband. The foundation's support group helped me start over." Grace hugged her. "That's exactly why we created it." Not everyone celebrated her success. Richard's old friends from the hospital board avoided the concert. Some community members still whispered about the scandal, suggesting Grace had been too harsh. "They're saying you ruined a good man's career," Rebecca reported during their weekly lunch. "He ruined it himself." Grace replied, "I just exposed the truth." The foundation's first year exceeded expectations. Dozens of women found support, job training, and legal aid. Grace's story of reinvention at 60 resonated with many who felt trapped in toxic relationships. One afternoon, Emily brought unexpected news. "Dad's trying to contact me. He wants to apologize to everyone." "What do you want to do?" Grace asked. "I'm not ready," Emily admitted, "but James is meeting him next month." Grace nodded. Everyone heals in their own time. The hospital's music therapy program flourished. Grace volunteered twice a week, playing for patients and teaching basic piano to children in long-term care. "Remember when you gave up music for Dad?" Sarah asked during one of their practice sessions. I didn't just give up music, Grace explained. I gave up myself. Never do that, sweetheart. Michael supported every new venture, from foundation fundraisers to Grace's growing piano student roster. Their home became a gathering place for women seeking change in their lives. "You've built something remarkable," he said one evening, listening to her practice. "We built it," she corrected him. "I couldn't have done this alone." Richard's letter arrived on a Tuesday. He wrote about his new life in Arizona, his work at a small clinic, his regret. "I understand now what you meant about living in someone's shadow," he wrote. "I'm finally learning to face my own reflection." Grace shared the letter with her children, but didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. The foundation's first anniversary celebration brought unexpected resistance. Some donors questioned helping women leave their marriages. Others called Grace a homewrecker. "They're missing the point," Rebecca argued during a board meeting. "This isn't about breaking homes, it's about building stronger women." Grace addressed the criticism head-on in her speech at the anniversary gala. "Strength isn't about enduring the unendurable," she told the crowd. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to walk away and start again." That evening, she played a new piece she'd composed, titled Awakening. Sarah recorded it for the Foundation's website, where it became a symbol of transformation. Later, as she and Michael drove home, Grace reflected on the year's journey. "Do you ever regret marrying someone with so much baggage?" she asked. Michael smiled. "I married someone with so much strength. The baggage was just the price of admission." At home, Grace found a message from another woman seeking help. Tomorrow, she would share her story again, play her music again, stand in her truth again. The silence of her past had become the symphony of her future. Grace and Michael celebrated their first anniversary in their home, surrounded by family. The dining room table, extended to its full length, barely contained the celebration. 3 generations plus the extended family they'd built through the foundation. "Remember last year?" Emily asked, helping her mother arrange dessert plates. "When we thought we were losing you? Instead, you gained a whole new mother," Grace smiled. The grandchildren had prepared a surprise, a group piano recital. Sarah, now 11, led her cousins in a piece they'd practiced for weeks. Grace watched them, remembering her own silenced dreams at their age. "Your turn, Grandma," Sarah announced. "Play with Grandpa Michael." The duet they performed was the same piece they'd played in the library when they first met. The children sat on the floor around the piano while James recorded the performance on his phone. "For the Foundation's website," he explained. During dinner, Rebecca raised her glass. "To Grace and Michael, who showed us that love only gets better with age." The conversation turned to the Foundation's success. Over the past year, they'd helped 30 women restart their lives, provided college scholarships to 15 children, and established music therapy programs in 3 hospitals. "We're expanding to Boston next month," Grace announced. "Emily's heading the new chapter." James shared his own news. "Dad called again. He's staying in Arizona, working at the clinic. He's different now." Grace nodded. "People can change if they want to." After dinner, the grandchildren gathered around Grace at the piano. "Tell us the story again," Sarah begged, "about how you pretended to be sick." "That's not the important part of the story," Grace corrected. "The important part is being true to yourself." Michael joined them, sitting beside his wife on the piano bench. The past year had proven that love could be better the second time around, when built on honesty and mutual respect. Later that evening, after the guests left, Grace found a letter from one of the Foundation's first clients. She'd finished her degree and started her own business. "You taught me that it's never too late to become yourself," the woman wrote. Grace shared the letter with Michael as they sat on their back porch. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Richard hadn't betrayed me." "You'd still be playing his song instead of your own," Michael replied. The next morning, Grace received an unexpected email from Jessica. She'd moved to Seattle, married a local businessman, and was working as a nurse again. "I learned the hard way that shortcuts to happiness never work," Jessica wrote. "I hope you can forgive me someday." Grace showed the email to Michael. "Do you think people deserve second chances?" "You gave me mine," he reminded her. "After my first wife left, I never thought I'd trust again." At the Foundation's weekly meeting, Grace shared her story with a new group of women. One asked if she regretted the years she'd spent with Richard. "No," Grace answered. "Those years taught me what love isn't, so I could recognize what love is." That evening, Grace and Michael played at a benefit concert for the hospital's music therapy program. Their duet ended with a standing ovation. "Ready for another year?" Michael asked as they drove home. Grace thought about the Foundation's expansion, her growing family, the women they'd helped, and the music that now filled every day of her life. "Ready for the rest of our lives," she replied. At home, Grace sat at her piano one last time that night. As she played, she thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Afraid, silent, living in someone else's shadow. That woman was gone. In her place sat a woman who had learned that true love doesn't demand silence, that strength comes in many forms, and that it's never too late to start playing your own song. The melody she played now was strong and clear, filling their home with the sound of hard-won happiness. It was the sound of truth, of freedom, and most importantly, of love that strengthens instead of diminishes. And this time, the music would never stop. If you enjoyed Grace's journey of rediscovery and empowerment, please hit that like button and leave a comment below sharing what touched you the most about her story. Do you know someone who needs to hear this message of hope? Share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us it's never too late to find your true voice. Remember, the most beautiful symphony is the one played by a heart that's finally free.